Now that you have started your steps into the suluk, you've already done Tawbah, I'm reminded of a saying of Sayyidina Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu anhu, who said that it's obligatory to do Tawbah from sins. But it's even more important than that to stay away from sins. Very, very important quote from Sayyidina Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu anhu. That it's obligatory to do Tawbah, but it's even more important that one stays away from sin. Similarly, once Sayyidina Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu came to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said to him, "Ittaqil maharim takun a'bad an-nas." That stay away from those things that have been prohibited by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and you will be among those who worships Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala the most. And especially the mashayikh of our silsila, they say that in this day and age, it's not very, very important that one fasts for 30 days, fasts for 40 days, fasts for 50 days or 100 days, or stays up 10, 15 nights in a row. But what is very, very important, especially in this day and age, is to avoid sinning. And there's a very beautiful quote by Khwaja Ubaidullah Ahrar rahimahullah. Now, Khwaja Ubaidullah Ahrar rahimahullah was one of the big shuyukh of the silsila, and he said that he who spends a day without sinning, it's as if he spent a day in the love of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And the question is, why did he say this? And the reason why he said this is that love without actions are mere words, mere feelings. But if you truly love somebody, then you have to act upon that. How? So if we truly love the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, then we have to act upon the sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And after years of experience on this path, having spent more than 10 years with my Shaykh now, I can very, very confidently tell you that one of the greatest sunnahs of the Prophet ﷺ is that the Prophet ﷺ completely abstained from anything that displeased Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is one of the greatest of sunnahs of the Prophet ﷺ. And this is the reason why Khwaja Ahrar said that he who spends a day without sinning is like he spent a day in the love of the Prophet ﷺ. So inshallah we'll start reading some of the malfudat of our Shaykh, and inshallah I'll explain them, and inshallah we hope that this will be of benefit to everybody. The first saying of the Shaykh is, he said, "We don't step forward, nor are we strong-willed." Now he's talking about people who want to get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But the Shaykh is saying that even after we make the intention of getting close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we don't step forward, nor are we strong-willed on the path. And then the Shaykh says, what we should try is that not a single hukum of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is broken. We should be afraid about breaking the ahkam of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala the same way that we are afraid of touching a snake. And I remember that an example, a very beautiful example that the Shaykh gave of this is, once when we were sitting with him, he said that if you saw a beautiful snake, and snakes are, subhanAllah, sometimes very, very beautiful. I mean, they're the colors and the textures of their skin. Now, if you saw a very, very beautiful snake, just because the snake is very, very beautiful, would you touch it? And you wouldn't. And similarly, if you saw an electric wire, now would you in any way whatsoever touch that electric wire? You wouldn't. And another example that the Shaykh gave is that if someone brings you a box of chocolates and tells you that there's no poison in any of these chocolates, except we put poison in just one of them. Now would you eat even one chocolate from that box of chocolates? No, you wouldn't. And so similarly, we should be afraid from breaking even a single rules from the ahkam of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then the Shaykh says that if, for example, we break the rules of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala due to our weakness, then we should ask for forgiveness right away. So if we break the rules of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala due to our weakness, we should ask for forgiveness right away. We should, through our tears, convince Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to forgive us right away. And the Shaykh said that once a wise person said a very wise thing. He said, the person who knowingly and intentionally leaves sinning, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will stop rejecting his du'as. So people often ask, so Shaykh, how can I bring myself to such a spiritual state that every single dua that I make, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will accept it? And so the Shaykh says that the way to become mustajab al-da'wat, the way to become such a person that every single one of your du'as is accepted by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is to completely stop sinning. And then the next point which the Shaykh explains is that you have to consider a sin to be a sin. And this is a disease of our modern age, that we don't consider sins to be sins. And so he says, if one considers sins to be sins, it becomes easy to leave them. But unfortunately, nowadays, people do not consider sins to be sins. Rather, they use excuses and stratagems in order to make sins lawful. And so, one very, very common sin is lying. But what do we tell ourselves? I'm actually not lying. I'm actually not lying, but what I'm doing is that I'm just making an excuse for the moment. But in reality, it's not an excuse that we're making. In reality, what we're doing is that we're lying. And so, the first step that we need to take is to accept that a sin that has been designated as a sin by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and by the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, this is actually a sin. And we need to convince ourselves about this. And then the Shaykh says, if a person considers sins to be sins and still commits a sin, then the person will eventually feel remorse about this. And because of the barakah of this remorse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give this person the opportunity to be forgiven. See, this is a key actually. If you out of your weakness consider a sin, but nevertheless, while you're committing that sin, you know that this is actually a sin, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give you the tawfiq for remorse more quickly. But if you try to deceive yourself and think that you can deceive Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by not considering the sin to be a sin, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala may possibly take away the opportunity for you to be forgiven in relation to the sin. Now, this is very, very important, which is that, how do we know what is a sin? And this is the reason why, this is a very, very special characteristic of our mashayikh, is that whenever someone joins the silsila, the shuyukh always encourage that person to seek knowledge of the deen, talab al-ilm. And that's why talab al-ilm is very, very important, so that when you sit with the ulama, it becomes very, very clear to you what are sins and what are not sins, what is haram and what is halal. And this is also why, in addition to seeking knowledge from the ulama, it's also very, very important to seek the suhbah of the awliya of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or to keep in rabita with one of the awliya of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to develop a connection, an islahi connection with somebody. So that person, when you share your own problems with that person will explain to you, will open new things to you in relation to what are sins and what are not sins.